They called her the Ghost of Park Avenue. For 7 years, Clara Sterling was the invisible woman standing in the shadow of her billionaire husband, Richard. She was mocked, ignored, and eventually replaced. When Richard handed her the divorce papers, he expected a war. He expected her to beg. Instead, she signed them quietly, packed a single bag, and vanished into the night. Richard thought he had won. He thought she was nobody. But 3 months later, when the engines of a Gulfstream G650 screamed over the tarmac at the year's biggest gala, Richard realized he hadn't just lost a wife, he had unleashed a rival. This is the story of how the woman he discarded returned to destroy him. The silence in the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue was expensive. It was the kind of silence that cost $50 million to curate soundproofed glass overlooking Central Park, plush velvet carpets that swallowed footsteps, and an air filtration system that made the atmosphere feel thin, almost sterile. Clara sat at the edge of the mahogany dining table, her hands folded in her lap. The dinner had been over for an hour, but the guests were still lingering in the cigar lounge. She could hear the low rumble of their laughter, specifically the baritone boom of her husband, Richard Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics. The acquisition of the Kensington Group is all but now done. Richard's voice drifted out, laced with the arrogance that had once charmed her, but now felt like a heavy stone on her chest. Old man Kensington doesn't have the stomach for a fight. I'll bleed him dry by Q3. And your wife? Another voice asked. It was Preston Wells, Richard's CFO and long-time enabler. She okay with you missing her birthday for the Tokyo summit next week? Clara flinched. Today was her birthday. Richard laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Clara. She doesn't care about that stuff. She's low maintenance. Honestly, I don't think she'd notice if I was gone for a month. She's happy with her garden and her charity luncheons. As long as the credit card works, Clara is fine. The men chuckled. The sound was like sandpaper against Clara's skin. It wasn't the first time he had dismissed her. For 7 years, Clara had been the perfect accessory. She was the sterling ornament. She organized the galas, she managed the household staff, she remembered the names of every board member's wife and children. When Richard's mother, the formidable Agatha Sterling, had fallen ill with dementia, it was Clara who sat by her bedside at Mount Sinai Hospital for weeks, holding her hand while Richard was too busy closing deals in Davos. But to Richard, she was furniture, pretty silent and easily ignored. Clara stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the glittering grid of Manhattan. She wasn't just a trophy. Before she was Clara Sterling, she was Clara Mitchell, a scholarship student at Wharton, who had graduated top of her class. She had met Richard when he was just a struggling heir trying to prove he wasn't a failure. She had edited his pitches. She had caught the accounting error in 2018 that would have cost the company millions. She had done it all from the shadows, letting him take the light. And tonight, on her 32nd birthday, he hadn't even bought a card. The door to the lounge opened, and Richard walked out, loosening his tie. He smelled of scotch and expensive tobacco. He stopped when he saw her blinking, as if surprised to find her still there. "Oh," he said. "You're still up. Look, Preston and the guys are heading to the box. I'm going to join them. Don't wait up." Clara turned slowly. "Richard," he sighed, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "What is it, Clara?" "Make it quick." "There's an envelope on your desk," she said softly. "What a bill. Just pay it." "No," she said. "It's the papers you asked Whitmore and Associates to draft last year. The ones you thought I didn't find." Richard froze. The air in the room shifted. He had threatened divorce a year ago during a heated argument, claiming he needed a wife with more fire, someone like the scandalous socialite Isabella Vance, though he never admitted it out loud. He had the papers drawn up to scare her, to keep her in line. "I signed them," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Stop being dramatic. Go to bed. We'll talk about your little mood swing in the morning. I'm not being dramatic, Richard. I'm being efficient. Isn't that what you like?" She gestured to the hallway. "I signed the NDA. I signed the asset waiver. I'm taking nothing but my clothes and the jewelry my grandmother gave me. You keep the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the accounts. I just want out." Richard stared at her. For a moment, a flicker of fear crossed his face, not because he loved her, but because he hated losing control. But then his ego took over. He looked at her simple beige dress, her pulled-back hair, her lack of makeup. He thought she was bluffing. He thought she was weak. "Fine," he sneered. "If you want to throw a tantrum, go ahead. Leave. But don't come crawling back when the real world chews you up. You've been living in a bubble, Clara. You won't last a week without the sterling name." "I guess we'll see," she whispered. She picked up a small carry-on bag from the floor. She walked past him, smelling the stale scotch on his breath one last time. She didn't look back. She took the private elevator down to the lobby, nodded to the doorman. Henry, who looked at her with sad, knowing eyes, and stepped out into the cold November night. She hailed a yellow cab, not a private car. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. Clara looked at the towering skyscraper one last time, the place where she had lost herself piece by piece. "Teterboro Airport," she said. "The private terminal." The driver raised an eyebrow, but hit the meter. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a burner phone. She dialed a number she hadn't used in 10 years. It rang once. "It's done," she said into the phone. "I'm coming home, Arthur." The first week without Clara was for Richard Sterling a celebration. He felt lighter. He told Preston and the board that the divorce was mutual and amicable, painting Clara as a woman who simply couldn't handle the pressure of his high-octane lifestyle. He moved Isabella, a stunning raven-haired model with a taste for drama and diamonds, into the penthouse 3 days later. Isabella was everything Clara wasn't. She was loud, she was demanding, and she looked incredible on his arm at the New York City Ballet Gala. The tabloids ate it up. Sterling's new flame. The upgrade of the century read the headline of the New York Post. Richard felt invincible, but the cracks started to show in the mundane, quiet moments. It started with the coffee. Richard sat at his breakfast table, barking into his phone. "Where is my espresso? It tastes like sludge." The new housekeeper, a terrified woman named Maria, trembled. "I made it exactly as the machine said." "Sir." Richard threw the cup into the sink. Clara used to source the beans herself from a small roaster in Colombia. She ground them every morning at 500 a.m., so the coffee would be ready when he woke up. He didn't know that. He just thought good coffee appeared. Then it was the schedule. "Why am I booked for a lunch with Senator Higgins?" Richard yelled at his assistant, Sarah, 2 weeks later. "I hate Higgins. He's a bore." "Sir," Sarah stammered. "Mrs. Sterling, I mean Clara, always handled the senator. She knew exactly what to say to get his vote on the zoning laws without you actually having to meet him. She used to take his wife to tea at the plaza." Richard fell silent. He had secured the zoning permits for his new Brooklyn tech hub last year. He thought it was his charm. It was Clara having tea. Then came the business hit. A month after the divorce, Richard sat in the boardroom of Sterling Dynamics, sweating. The Kensington deal, the one he bragged about on Clara's birthday, was falling apart. They found a loophole in the contract, Preston said, his face pale. Clause 14B regarding environmental liability. If we acquire them, we inherit a massive toxic waste suit in Ohio. How did we miss this? Richard slammed his fist on the table. We have an army of lawyers. Preston hesitated. Well, usually Clara proofreads the final contracts on the weekends. You used to bring them home, remember? You said she liked to play office. But she actually flagged the environmental risk in the Anderson merger last year. We thought you were the one catching these things. Richard sank into his leather chair. The silence in the room was deafening. He looked around the table at the faces of men who were paid millions to be smart, yet they had all been relying on the unpaid labor of the wife he had just discarded. Fix it, Richard whispered. Just fix it. He went home that night exhausted. He wanted peace. Instead, he found Isabella throwing a vase against the wall. You promised we'd go to St. Bart's this weekend, she screamed. My friends are already there. You're always working. You're boring, Richard. Richard looked at her, beautiful, fiery, and utterly exhausting. He thought of Clara. Clara, who would have had a hot meal waiting. Clara, who would have massaged his shoulders and asked about the Kensington deal with genuine insight. Clara, who never asked for anything. He walked past Isabella, ignoring her screaming, and went into his study. He poured a drink. He sat at his desk where the divorce papers had been. He opened his laptop and did something he hadn't done in years. He Googled her. Clara Sterling. Nothing. No social media, no new address, no paparazzi photos. It was as if she had ceased to exist. She'll come back, he muttered to himself, downing the scotch. She has no money, no connections. She's probably living in a motel in Queens. She'll come crawling back, asking for alimony. He was wrong. At that very moment, 3,000 miles away, in a sprawling vineyard estate in Napa Valley, Clara was not crying in a motel. She was standing on a balcony, overlooking rows of grapes that glowed golden in the sunset. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than Richard's car, and she wasn't alone. A man with silver hair and a kind, sharp face walked up behind her. He handed her a glass of wine. This was Arthur Pendleton, the reclusive billionaire owner of Pendleton Global, a man who had been Richard Sterling's fiercest rival until he retired 5 years ago. The jet is fueled, Clara, Arthur said softly. We fly to New York tomorrow. Are you ready? Clara took a sip of the wine. Her eyes were no longer soft and submissive. They were cold, clear, and focused. I'm not just ready. Arthur, she said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. I'm overdue. She turned to look at the man who had been her late father's best friend, the man who had secretly paid for her education, the man who knew her worth. Richard thinks he runs New York, Clara said. Let's go show him who really built his throne. The air in Napa Valley was different from New York. It didn't smell of exhaust and ambition. It smelled of damp earth and old money. For the first 2 weeks at Arthur Pendleton's estate, Clara did nothing but sleep. 7 years of cortisol, 7 years of walking on eggshells, 7 years of suppressing her own brilliance to stroke Richard's fragile ego. It had all taken a physical toll. She slept for 14 hours a day, waking only to eat the simple meals prepared by Arthur's chef, Jean-Luc. Arthur left her alone. He knew that before you could build a weapon, you had to forge the steel, and the steel needed to cool. On the morning of the 15th day, Clara walked into Arthur's library. It was a massive room, lined with first editions and maps of the world. Arthur was sitting by the fire, reading the Wall Street Journal. "I'm done sleeping," Clara said. Her voice was raspy but steady. Arthur lowered the paper. He looked at her. She was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a white linen shirt, but her posture had changed. The slump of the submissive wife was gone. She stood with her weight evenly distributed, her chin up. "Good," Arthur said, "because Richard's stock dropped for yesterday. The Kensington deal is leaking oil just like you predicted. He's panicked. He fired his chief legal officer yesterday." Clara walked over to the desk and picked up a tablet. She scrolled through the market data with a speed and fluency that would have shocked Richard. "He fired Matthews." Clara scoffed. Matthews was the only one holding the compliance department together. Richard is cutting off his arm to save a finger. He's going to try to pivot to the Asian tech market to cover the loss. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "How do you know?" "Because that's what he did in 2019 when the European merger failed. He's predictable. Arthur, he thinks he's a visionary, but he plays from a playbook I wrote for him 5 years ago." Arthur stood up and walked to a wall covered in a velvet curtain. He pulled a cord, revealing a massive whiteboard filled with schematics, flowcharts, and corporate structures. "Then let's write a new playbook," Arthur said. "My company, Pendleton Global, has been dormant in the public eye since I retired. People think I'm an old man growing grapes. They don't know I've been liquidating assets to build a war chest." He handed Clara a marker. "I have the capital," Arthur said, "but I'm too old for the dogfight. I need a CEO. I need someone who knows Richard's weaknesses better than he knows them himself. I need someone the street won't see coming." Clara looked at the board. She saw the structure of a new shell company, Aurelius Capital. "You want me to run it?" Clara asked. "I want you to be it," Arthur corrected. "Clara Sterling is dead. She was a mouse. I want you to become the predator." The next 2 months were a blur of intensity. This wasn't a makeover montage of shopping bags and spa days, though that happened too. This was a boot camp for corporate warfare. Clara spent her mornings with Elias Thorne, a crisis PR manager who had salvaged the reputations of senators and royalty. He taught her how to speak in sound bites, how to hold a room with silence, how to use her eyes to intimidate. "You have a habit of looking down when you finish a sentence," Elias scolded her one afternoon. "It's a submission signal. Stop it. When you finish speaking, you look them dead in the eye and dare them to interrupt." Her afternoons were spent with Kenji Sato, a forensic accountant who flew in from Tokyo. Together, they dissected Richard's emperor. They found the shell companies in the Cayman Islands Richard used to hide debt. They found the inflated asset reports. They found the leverage points. "He's overextended," Clara said one evening, circling a number in red. "He leveraged the Park Avenue penthouse against the Brooklyn tech hub. If the tech hub gets delayed by zoning issues, he defaults on his personal loans. And who controls the zoning board in Brooklyn now?" Arthur asked, sipping an espresso. Clara smiled. It was a cold smile. "Senator Higgins, the man whose wife I used to have tea with. The man Richard thinks is a bore." Arthur nodded. "Make the call." Then came the aesthetic transformation. Arthur flew in a stylist from Paris, a woman named Colette, who had dressed royalty. Colette took one look at Clara's beige wardrobe and threw it all in the trash. "Beige is for apologies," Colette said with a sneer. "You are not apologizing anymore." They cut her hair. The long, wavy locks that Richard liked, because they made her look sweet, were chopped into a sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed her jawline like a blade. They dyed it a shade darker, a rich espresso color that made her green eyes pop with startling intensity. She traded the flowy skirts for tailored power suits by Tom Ford and Alexander McQueen. Sharp shoulders, clinched waists, stilettos that clicked on the floor like gunshots. By month 3, Clara looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The ghost was gone. In her place was a woman who looked expensive, dangerous, and completely untouchable. "You're ready," Arthur said, standing behind her reflection. "For what?" Clara asked. "The Metropolitan Winter Charity Ball is this weekend," Arthur said. "It's the biggest event of the New York season. Every shark, every hedge fund manager, every rival will be there. Richard is the guest of honor. He's planning to announce his new IPO." Clara turned around. "He won't be expecting us." "No." Arthur grinned. "He thinks you're gone. He thinks I'm retired. We're going to walk into his house, drink his champagne, and announce the launch of Aurelius Capital." Clara picked up her new phone, a sleek encrypted device. "Let's fuel the jet." Arthur. The Metropolitan Winter Charity Ball was the kind of event where the air conditioning smelled like expensive perfume, and the flowers cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Held at a historic mansion on Fifth Avenue, the red carpet was a gauntlet of blinding flashbulbs and screaming paparazzi. Inside, the mood was tense. The financial world was jittery. Rumors were swirling about a new player in the market, a company called Aurelius that had been quietly buying up tech stocks, but no one knew who was behind it. Richard Sterling stood near the ice sculpture, swirling his martini. He looked tired. The bags under his eyes were visible, even through the heavy concealer his makeup artist had applied. Next to him, Isabella was complaining. She was wearing a dress that was too loud a neon pink concoction, with feathers that shed every time she moved. "Richard, stop looking at your phone," Isabella whined, hanging off his arm. "The photographers are over there. We need to look happy." "I am happy," Richard snapped, checking his stock ticker. I have a bad feeling." The zoning permit for Brooklyn was denied this morning. Higgins blocked it. "Who cares about Brooklyn?" Isabella rolled her eyes. "Look, there's Anna Wintour. Introduce me." Richard sighed. He missed Clara. He missed how she used to stand silently by his side, handing him water, whispering the names of people he forgot, smoothing over his rough edges. Isabella was a jagged edge that cut him every time he moved. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. "Please clear the main entrance. We have a late arrival." Richard checked his watch. It was 9:30 p.m. Everyone who mattered was already here. Who would dare arrive this late? Probably some reality TV star trying to get attention. Richard muttered to Preston Wells. But then the room changed. It started as a murmur near the door, a ripple of sound that spread through the crowd like a wave. Then the hush fell. The heavy oak doors swung open. The first thing people noticed was Arthur Pendleton. The silver-haired lion of Wall Street hadn't been seen at a gala in 5 years. His presence alone was a headline. He walked with a cane, Not because he needed it, but because it looked regal. He wore a tuxedo that fit perfectly. But no one was looking at Arthur. They were looking at the woman on his arm. She was wearing a dress of liquid velvet, a deep blood-red crimson that absorbed the light. It was backless, structured, and daring with a slit that ran up her thigh. Around her neck sat the Pendleton diamonds, a necklace worth $6 million that hadn't been worn since Arthur's late wife died 20 years ago. Her hair was sharp, her makeup was flawless. Her face was a mask of cool, amused indifference. The photographers went feral. The flashes were so intense, it looked like a lightning storm had trapped itself in the foyer. Who is that? Is that a model? Wait, is that... Richard squinted. He felt a strange buzzing in his ears. The woman walked with a stride he didn't recognize, confident, predatory. She didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, scanning the room as if she owned the building. She stopped at the top of the grand staircase. She looked down at the crowd. Her eyes locked onto Richard. The glass slipped from Richard's hand. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "Clara," he whispered. Isabella looked at him, then at the woman. "Who is Clara?" "That's your ex-wife." The mouse. Clara began to descend the stairs. She didn't hold the rail. She moved like royalty. Arthur walked beside her, a proud smirk on his face. The crowd parted. It wasn't polite. It was instinctual. People moved out of her way, like water parting for a shark. She walked straight toward Richard. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He expected her to look tired. He expected her to look sad. He expected her to look like the woman he threw away. Instead, she looked like a goddess of vengeance. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. The smell of her perfume, santal and black rose, hit him. It was intoxicating and unfamiliar. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was lower, smoother than he remembered. "Clara." Richard stammered. You look expensive," she finished for him. A small, cruel smile touched her lips. "I suppose freedom suits me." Isabella stepped forward, sensing a threat. "Well, look who decided to show up. Did you spend your alimony on a rental dress, sweetie?" The room went deadly silent. Everyone waited for the catfight. Clara didn't even look at Isabella. She didn't turn her head. She didn't blink. She simply kept her eyes on Richard, rendering Isabella completely invisible. It was the ultimate power move. "Richard," Clara said, ignoring the woman entirely. "I heard about the zoning issue in Brooklyn. Terrible luck. Senator Higgins can be so particular." Richard paled. "How do you know about that?" "It happened this morning." "I know," Clara said. "I was having breakfast with him." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "You?" "What?" "Oh, and the Kensington deal." Clara continued, her voice light and conversational, as if discussing the weather. "I wouldn't count on that closing. Aurelius Capital just put in a counterbid at 15% above your offer." Richard's knees went weak. "Aurelius? You know who runs Aurelius?" Clara stepped closer. She reached out and adjusted Richard's bow tie, a gesture that was once intimate, but now felt like a noose tightening. "I do," she whispered, leaning into his ear, so only he could hear. "Check the incorporation papers, Richard. I'm the CEO." She patted his chest, stepped back and turned to the stunned crowd. "Now, if you'll excuse us." Clara said, her voice projecting to the room. "Arthur and I have a celebration to attend to. We just acquired a very large, very interesting company." She took Arthur's arm. As they walked away, leaving Richard standing amidst the shattered glass and the ruins of his ego, Clara looked over her shoulder one last time. "Happy belated birthday to me," she said. And then she walked into the ballroom, leaving Richard Sterling suffocating in her wake. The morning after the gala, the hangover at Sterling Dynamics was not from alcohol. It was from panic. Richard stormed into his office at 7:00 a.m., his tuxedo from the night before still crumpled on the floor of his private bathroom where he had slept. The phones were ringing off the hook. "The stock is down 12%. Preston Wells said, pacing the room, sweating through his shirt. "The market is reacting to the Aurelius announcement. They think you lost your touch, Richard. They think you got played." "I didn't get played," Richard roared, throwing a tablet across the room. "She's bluffing. Clara doesn't know how to run a conglomerate. She's a secretary with a rich sugar daddy." But the fax machine in the corner whirred to life. It spat out a single document. Preston picked it up. His hands shook. "What is it?" Richard snapped. "It's a notification from the SEC." Preston whispered. "Aurelius Capital just filed a 13D form." "Speak English, Preston." "They bought a stake." Preston looked up, his face grey. "Richard, they didn't just outbid us for Kensington. While we were at the gala, drinking champagne, Clara and Arthur were buying Sterling Dynamics stock on the Asian markets. They own 15% of the company." Richard fell back into his chair. 15% was enough to demand a seat on the board. It was enough to call for a vote of no confidence. "Get the legal team," Richard hissed. "Sue them. Antitrust, conflict of interest, anything. Stall them." But it was too late. At 10:00 a.m., the glass doors of the conference room opened. The entire board of directors was already seated, looking grim. They hadn't told Richard the meeting started early. At the head of the table where Richard usually sat, stood Clara. She wore a navy blue power suit, her hair slicked back, looking every inch the corporate raider. "You can't be in here," Richard shouted, bursting into the room. "Security, get this woman out." "Sit down," Richard said. George Halloway, the chairman of the board. "Ms. Sterling." "Excuse me. Ms. Mitchell is our largest minority shareholder. She has a right to be heard. She's my ex-wife. This is a vendetta." Clara didn't scream. She didn't argue. She simply pressed a button on the remote in her hand. The projector screen behind her lit up. It showed a timeline of the failed Kensington deal, the EPA violations in Ohio, and most damning of all, a secret transfer of $5 million from company accounts to a personal shell company Richard had used to buy Isabella a villa in Tuscany. The room gasped. This, Clara said, her voice cool and clinical, is embezzlement, or at the very least, gross misuse of shareholder funds. She looked at Richard. Her eyes were void of any love they once held. "You missed the EPA clause in the Ohio contract because you were too busy hiding assets for your mistress," Clara said. "I tried to warn you about the environmental risks a year ago. You told me to stick to flower arranging." She turned to the board. "Aurelius Capital is willing to buy out the debt Sterling Dynamics has incurred," she announced. "We will inject capital and stabilize the stock. But we have one condition." "What condition?" George Halloway asked. Clara pointed a manicured finger at Richard. Him, she said. He steps down as CEO, effective immediately, and he forfeits his golden parachute to cover the losses he caused. Richard looked around the table. He looked for allies. He looked for Preston. But Preston was staring at his shoes. George Halloway was nodding slowly. They were cutting him loose. "You can't do this," Richard whispered. "I built this company." "No, Richard," Clara said, closing her folder. "Your father built it. I maintained it. You just spent it." By 2:00 p.m., Richard Sterling was escorted out of his own building by security. He stood on the sidewalk of Wall Street, holding a cardboard box containing a framed photo of himself and a stapler. It was a humiliation so complete, so public, that he felt numb. He couldn't go to the Hamptons. The company jet was grounded. He hailed a cab and went to the penthouse. He needed comfort. He needed Isabella. He needed someone to tell him he was still a king. He opened the door to the penthouse. The place was a mess. Suitcases were open on the floor. Isabella was frantically throwing designer clothes into a Louis Vuitton trunk. "Isabella," Richard asked, dropping his box. "What are you doing?" She spun around. She wasn't wearing the diamonds he gave her. She was wearing travel clothes. "I saw the news, Richard." She spat. "Stock dropped 40%. You're under investigation for embezzlement." "Are you kidding me? It's a misunderstanding." "Clara set me up." "I'll fix it." "Fix it with what?" Isabella laughed, a shrill, cruel sound. "I tried to use the black card at Bergdorf's an hour ago. Declined. Do you know how embarrassing that is?" The salesgirl cut the card in front of me. "Isabella, baby, please. I just need a few days to liquidate some assets." "You don't have assets," she screamed. "I called my lawyer. The penthouse is leveraged. The cars are leased by the company. You're broke, Richard." "And I don't do broke." She zipped up her bag. "I'm going to Miami," she said. "Julian has a yacht there. He's been texting me for months." "Julian." Richard felt sick. Julian was his 25-year-old intern. "You're leaving me for an intern." "He's not an intern anymore." Isabella smirked as she walked to the door. "He just got hired at Aurelius Capital. Apparently they pay very well." The door slammed. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Richard sank onto the floor. He looked around the empty apartment. The view of Central Park was grey and rainy. For the first time in 7 years, he was truly alone. He thought of Clara. He thought of how she used to make him tea when he was stressed, how she listened to him rant for hours without complaint, how she built him up when he felt small. He realized with a terrifying clarity that Clara was the only person who had ever actually loved him, not his money, and he had treated her like a servant. Desperation clawed at his throat. He pulled out his phone. He dialed her number. It rang 3 times. "This is Clara," her voice answered. It was professional, distant. "Clara," Richard choked out. "Clara, please, you have to stop this." "Richard." She sounded surprised he had the audacity to call. "I'll give you anything," he begged. Tears were streaming down his face now. "I'll give you the house. I'll give you the shares. Just stop the investigation. Don't let them prosecute me. I'll go to jail, Clara. Please, for the sake of what we had." There was a long silence on the line. "What we had?" Clara asked softly. "Richard, do you remember my 30th birthday?" "What, my 30th birthday?" she repeated. "I had a miscarriage that morning. I was in the hospital. I called you 5 times. Do you remember what you texted me? Richard squeezed his eyes shut. He remembered. He was in a meeting with the Japanese investors. He had texted, "Stop calling, I'm busy, handle it." Richard sobbed. "I didn't know it was that bad." "You didn't ask," Clara said. Her voice was cold as ice. "You wanted a wife with fire. Richard, you wanted drama. You wanted the real world. Well, welcome to it, Clara. I'm begging you." "Save your breath," she said. "You're going to need it for the deposition tomorrow." "Oh. And Richard?" "Yes," he whispered, a sliver of hope rising. "You have 24 hours to vacate the penthouse," she said. "Arthur just bought the mortgage from the bank. I'm turning it into a shelter for women recovering from financial abuse." Click. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone. The sun was setting over the city he used to think he owned. Now he was just another ghost in the machine. But the story wasn't quite over. Clara had one final twist of the knife, left a public finale to ensure the world knew exactly who had won. 3 months later, the winter snow had turned to grey slush on the streets of Manhattan. For Richard Sterling, the world had shrunk. He no longer lived in the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue. He was currently staying in a sublet studio apartment in Jersey City, overlooking a parking lot. His assets had been frozen, seized, and liquidated to pay off the massive debts and legal fees from the embezzlement investigation. He had avoided prison only by cutting a plea deal that banned him from serving as a director of a public company for 10 years. Today was the final formality, the divorce settlement. Richard sat in a small, sterile conference room at the courthouse. He wore a suit that was 2 years old, one of the few he had managed to keep. It looked tired. He looked tired. He had lost 20 pounds and his hair was thinning. The door opened and Clara walked in. She didn't look like a CEO. She looked like freedom. She wore a cream-colored cashmere coat and sunglasses she didn't bother to remove immediately. She was flanked by Arthur Pendleton and her lawyer. She sat opposite Richard. She didn't say hello. She just slid a folder across the table. "Sign here." "Here and here," her lawyer said. Richard picked up the pen. His hand trembled. "Clara," he said, his voice cracking. She paused, looking up from her phone. She looked at him, not with anger, but with the polite detachment one might have for a stranger on a subway. "Yes, Richard. He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to know. Do you hate me?" The room went quiet. Arthur shifted in his seat, ready to intervene, but Clara held up a hand. She took off her sunglasses. Her green eyes were clear, bright, and utterly peaceful. "I don't hate you, Richard," she said softly. "Hating you would require energy. And honestly, I don't think about you enough to hate you." The words hit him harder than a scream would have. Indifference was the ultimate insult. "I made you," Richard whispered, trying to cling to the last shred of his ego. "I found you when you were a student. I gave you a life." Clara laughed. It was a genuine light sound. "Richard, look at us." She gestured between them. "You're in a basement conference room in Jersey. I'm about to fly to Paris for Fashion Week to launch Aurelius Luxury. You didn't make me. You just stood in my light." She tapped the paper. "Sign the papers. You get to keep your watch. That was my gift to you. Consider it severance." Richard looked down at his wrist. The Patek Philippe. He had almost pawned it yesterday for rent money. He signed. Clara stood up immediately. She didn't linger. She buttoned her coat, shook hands with the mediator, and turned to leave. Clara Richard called out one last time as she reached the door. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Was it worth it?" he asked. "Destroying everything we built. Was it worth it just to prove a point?" Clara turned her head slightly. A small smile played on her lips. "I didn't destroy anything, Richard," she said. "I just took back what was mine. And yes, it was worth every single penny." She walked out. Richard sat alone in the silence. He heard the click of her heels fading down the hallway, a sound that used to annoy him, but now sounded like the steady ticking of a clock that had run out of time. Outside, the paparazzi were waiting, but they weren't waiting for him. Richard walked out the side exit, pulling his collar up against the wind. He watched from across the street as Clara stepped into a waiting black SUV. The cameras flashed, blinding and relentless. She didn't hide. She smiled, waved, and slipped into the car. As the car pulled away, merging into the traffic that flowed toward the private airfield, Richard checked his pocket. He had a subway card with $12 on it. He turned toward the train station. It was a long ride back to Jersey. The winter in New York that year was cruel, but it was nothing compared to the winter inside Richard Sterling's life. 3 months had passed since the boardroom coup, and the landscape of Richard's existence had been razed to the ground. He no longer woke up in the master suite at 432 Park Avenue, with its heated floors and view of the skyline. Instead, he woke up to the sound of a garbage truck reversing in an alleyway in Jersey City. He was living in a sublet studio above a laundromat. The radiator clanked and hissed like a dying animal, and the windows were drafty enough to let in the smell of exhaust and fried food. His assets, the Hamptons estate, the vintage Jaguar, the art collection, had been seized by the DOJ and liquidated to pay the massive fines levied against Sterling Dynamics. He had avoided prison only by the skin of his teeth, cutting a plea deal that stripped him of his voting rights and banned him from serving on any public board for the next decade. Richard sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, buttoning his shirt. It was a Brioni suit, one of the few things he had managed to salvage before the marshals locked him out of the penthouse. Once it had made him look like a titan. Now it hung loosely on his frame. He had lost 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, the skin grey and papery from stress and cheap takeout. He checked his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. He tried to summon the arrogant sneer that used to terrify junior executives. It didn't work. The eyes staring back were haunted. Today was the end. The final divorce settlement. He took the PATH train into Manhattan. He used to take a helicopter from Teterboro. He used to complain if the seat warmer in the Mercedes wasn't calibrated to 72 degrees. Now he stood squeezed between a construction worker and the exhausted nurse, holding onto a greasy metal pole, trying not to make eye contact with anyone who might recognize him from the tabloids. The courthouse was a bleak, imposing building downtown. It smelled of floor wax and misery. Richard met his lawyer in the hallway, a court-appointed attorney named Mr. Henderson, who had coffee stains on his tie and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "She's already inside," Henderson said, checking his watch. "Let's make this quick, Mr. Sterling. I have an arraignment at noon." Richard nodded, his throat tight. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of Conference Room B. The room was small, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a sickly pallor over everything. But in the center of the room, sitting on a metal folding chair, as if it were a throne, was Clara. If Richard looked like a ghost, Clara looked like she was fed on the blood of stars. She was wearing a coat of cream-colored cashmere that looked soft enough to melt. Underneath, a tailored dress of charcoal wool hugged her frame. Her hair, the sharp bob that had signaled her transformation, was perfectly styled. She was typing on her phone, her fingers moving with a rapid, rhythmic precision. She didn't look up when he entered. Flanking her were two men. One was her high-powered attorney from Whitmore and Associates, a shark in a three-piece suit. The other was Arthur Pendleton. The old billionaire sat with his hands resting on his cane, watching Richard with a look of pity that was far worse than anger. Richard pulled out a chair and sat down. The metal scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. "Clara," Richard said. His voice sounded rusty. Clara finished her text, hit send, and then slowly placed the phone face down on the table. She looked at him. Her green eyes were hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses. "Richard," she acknowledged. Her tone was neutral. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was the tone one uses for a telemarketer. "Shall we proceed?" Her lawyer interjected, opening a thick binder. "We have the final addendums here." As agreed. Ms. Mitchell, formally Mrs. Sterling, will retain sole ownership of Aurelius Capital and its subsidiaries. Mr. Sterling agrees to waive all claims to spousal support. In exchange, Ms. Mitchell agrees to assume the remaining liability for the cleanup costs in Ohio, effectively clearing Mr. Sterling of the civil suits. It was a mercy kill. She was saving him from bankruptcy court, but taking his dignity as payment. "Sign here, here, and here," the lawyer said, sliding the document across the table. Richard picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the court. His hand trembled. He looked at the bold letters at the top of the page. Dissolution of marriage. 7 years. 7 years of dinners, of parties, of him talking and her listening. 7 years of him thinking he was the sun, and she was just a planet caught in his gravity. He realized now, with a sick, sinking feeling, that she hadn't been a planet. She had been the gravity itself. Without her, he had simply floated away into the void. He signed his name. The ink was black and final. Richard Sterling. He pushed the papers back. Clara picked up a gold fountain pen, probably worth more than Richard's current apartment, and signed her name with a flourish. "Clara Mitchell." "It's done," the mediator said, stamping the document. Clara capped her pen. She stood up immediately, smoothing out her coat. She turned to Arthur. "The car is waiting. We need to get to Teterboro. The flight to Paris leaves in an hour." "Paris," Richard blurted out. Clara paused. She hadn't moved to leave yet, but her body language was already out the door. She looked down at him. "Fashion Week," she said simply. "We're launching the new luxury division of Aurelius." Richard stood up. He felt a desperate, clawing need to make her feel something. Anything. Anger, regret, sadness. He needed to know that he had mattered. "Clara, wait." She stopped. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were clear, bright, and terrifyingly peaceful. "What is it, Richard?" He gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white. "I need to know. Do you hate me? After everything I did. The neglect, Isabella. The humiliation. Do you hate me?" The room went dead silent. Even the lawyers stopped packing their briefcases. Arthur watched Clara closely. Clara looked at Richard. She studied his frayed collar, his tired eyes, his desperate posture. She tilted her head slightly, as if examining a bug she had found on her windshield. "Hate you," she repeated softly. A small, dry chuckle escaped her lips. "Oh, Richard, you overestimate yourself." She took a step closer, not to intimidate him, but to ensure he heard every syllable. "Hate requires passion, Richard. It requires energy. To hate you, I would have to wake up in the morning and think about you. I would have to care about your existence." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't hate you," she said. "I'm indifferent to you. You're just a bad investment I finally wrote off. I don't think about you at all." Richard felt the breath leave his lungs. It would have been better if she had slapped him. If she had screamed, thrown a vase, cursed his name, it would have meant he still held power over her emotions. But this emptiness, this was the true death of Richard Sterling. "I made you," he whispered, his voice cracking, trying one last time to rewrite history. "I found you when you were a scholarship student. I gave you a life. I gave you the Sterling name." Clara's expression hardened just a fraction. "You didn't make me, Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a steel whisper. "You rented me. You used my brain to build your fortune and my patience to build your ego. You stood in my light and convinced me I was the shadow." She turned to the door. And regarding the Sterling name, she glanced back over her shoulder. "You can keep it. It's not worth much anymore." She walked out. Arthur Pendleton gave Richard a final nod, a gesture of finality, and followed her. Richard stood alone in the conference room. The silence was deafening. He looked down at his wrist. The Patek Philippe watch she had given him years ago was still there. She had let him keep it. He realized now it wasn't a gift. It was a reminder of the time he had wasted. He walked out of the courthouse 10 minutes later. The wind on the street was biting. Across the street, a commotion was unfolding. A sleek black SUV was idling at the curb. Paparazzi were swarming their flashbulbs, popping like fireworks in the grey afternoon. Richard stopped and watched. Clara emerged from the courthouse doors. The wind caught her coat, making it billow like a cape. She didn't shrink from the cameras. She didn't hide. She smiled a dazzling, victorious smile that he had never seen when they were married. She waved to the press, slipped into the back seat of the luxury car, and the door slammed shut with a heavy, expensive thud. The car pulled away, merging seamlessly into the traffic, heading toward a private jet toward Paris, toward a future that had no room for him. Richard stood on the sidewalk. People brushed past him, bumping his shoulder, not apologizing. He wasn't Richard Sterling, the billionaire, anymore. He was just a guy in a cheap suit, standing in the cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his Metro card. He had $12 left on it. He turned his collar up against the wind and began the long walk to the subway station. It would be a long ride back to Jersey. The rise and fall of Richard Sterling became a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of Wall Street. It is a story that teaches a brutal, necessary truth: never underestimate the person who holds your life together from the shadows. Richard believed power was about noise, headlines, and intimidation. He forgot that true power is silent. He forgot that the foundation of his empire wasn't his charm or his family name. It was the brilliance of the woman he treated as invisible. Clara didn't just survive her divorce, she transcended it. She proved that dignity isn't something given to you by a man. It is something you forge yourself. And sometimes the quietest signature on a piece of paper is the loudest declaration of war. And that, my friends, is the story of Clara and Richard. It's a harsh reminder that karma doesn't always wait for the next life. Sometimes it arrives in a Gulf Stream G650. I want to know what you think. Did Richard deserve to lose absolutely everything, or was Clara's revenge too cold? Personally, I think he got exactly what he ordered. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and redemption, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about karma hitting hard, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Comment Team Clara down below if you would have done the same thing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.